Hey guys, tonight we journey back in time, not just to a place but to an idea, the grandeur and the grit of the Roman Empire. We'll leave behind the Hollywood image of gleaming marble and flawless legions to uncover the slow, bloody and brilliant story of how a small muddy city on 7 hills grew to command the known world. This is a saga of myths and master plans, of citizen farmers who became conquerors, of a republic that bled to death to give birth to an empire, and of an echo that still shapes our world today. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy these deep dives into the past. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what type it is. It's always fascinating to see our global community. Now, dim the lights, perhaps turn on a fan for that soft ambient hum, and let's travel back to the banks of the Tiber, where our story begins not with an empire, but with a legend. Our story begins not in a world of marble and gold, not in the grand forum of a sprawling empire, but in a quiet, forgotten corner of a rugged land. Let your mind drift back in time to an Italy before Rome was Rome, an Italy of dense forests, wolf-haunted hills, and misty, fever-ridden marshes. This is a landscape of scattered tribes and small, fortified villages, a place where life is hard and the gods are never far away. At the heart of our story is a lazy, winding river, the Tiber. Its waters are muddy brown, its banks prone to unpredictable floods, and rising from these marshy banks are a cluster of unremarkable mounds, the 7 hills. They are not yet the glorious Palatine or the mighty Capitoline. They are simply muddy slopes covered in scrub and thickets, a place of little consequence. It is here, in this land of myth and mud, that the seed of the world's greatest empire will be planted, not by a grand design, but by the will of the gods and the desperate struggles of a lost people. To understand Rome, we must first travel even further back, across the sea to the dying embers of a legendary war. We must go to the smoking ruins of Troy. As the victorious Greeks sack the great city, a Trojan prince named Aeneas, son of the goddess Venus, escapes the slaughter. He is a refugee, a man who has lost everything, but he carries with him the weight of a divine prophecy. On his shoulders he carries his elderly father Anchises, and in his hands he clutches the sacred household gods of his people. He is not just fleeing a burning city, he is carrying the destiny of a new one. For years, Aeneas and his small band of Trojan survivors wander the Mediterranean, their journey a long and sorrowful odyssey. They are battered by storms sent by the wrathful goddess Juno. They are tempted by strange lands, and they are guided by omens and dreams. Finally, after a long and weary voyage, their ships make landfall on the coast of Latium in central Italy. This is the Promised Land. Here Aeneas forges a difficult alliance with the local king, Latinus, and marries his daughter, Lavinia. From this union of Trojan hero and Latin princess, a new people is born, a people who will one day call themselves Romans. They are a people forged from loss, from wandering, and from a deep, unshakable belief that they have been chosen by the gods for a special purpose. Our story now leaps forward several generations. The descendants of Aeneas have built the proud city of Alba Longa in the hills of Latium. Here, a familiar tragic tale unfolds. The rightful king, Numitor, a good and gentle ruler, is overthrown by his ambitious and cruel younger brother Amulius. To secure his stolen throne, Amulius murders Numitor's sons and, in an act of calculated cruelty, forces Numitor's only daughter, Rhea Silvia, to become a Vestal virgin. As a priestess sworn to the goddess Vesta, she must remain a virgin for 30 years, thus ensuring that Numitor's bloodline and any legitimate claim to the throne will die with her. But the gods have other plans. The will of a mortal king is no match for the desires of an immortal. One day, as Rhea Silvia sleeps by the banks of a sacred spring, she is visited by a majestic and powerful figure. It is Mars, the god of war. From this divine union, Rhea Silvia conceives, and in time she gives birth to twin boys. They are strong, beautiful, and half divine, a living testament to a destiny that their usurper uncle cannot control. Their names are Romulus and Remus. When the usurper King Amulius learns of their birth, he is consumed by fear and rage. These two infants represent the greatest threat to his power. He orders a servant to take the twins and drown them in the Tiber River. The servant, his heart filled with a reluctant pity, places the two sleeping infants in a small reed basket and sets it adrift on the river's currents. At that time, the Tiber was swollen from heavy rains, its waters overflowing its banks. The basket does not sink into the depths. Instead, it is carried gently downstream until it comes to rest in the shallow floodwaters at the base of a hill, the Palatine, its journey ending safely under the sheltering branches of a wild fig tree. As the two infants lie there, helpless and crying with hunger, a miraculous event occurs. A sound is heard in the undergrowth, the soft padding of a pause. A great she-wolf, a lupa, emerges from the trees. Her fur is thick, her eyes intelligent. She has just lost her own cubs and is drawn by the sound of the crying infants. But instead of seeing them as prey, she is filled with a divine maternal instinct. She lies down beside the basket and gently nudges the two boys, offering them her teats. And so, in the quiet wilderness, under the shade of a sacred fig tree, the twin sons of a god are nursed by a wild beast, their first taste of life a feral, life-saving miracle. They are soon discovered by a simple shepherd of the king, a man named Faustulus. He sees the incredible sight of the she-wolf caring for the human infants. Awed by the omen, he takes the two boys home to his wife Laurentia. And there, in a humble shepherd's hut, the two founders of the world's greatest empire are raised. They grow up strong, wild, and fearless. They do not know of their royal blood or their divine parentage. They know only the life of the hills, the tending of flocks, and the thrill of the hunt. They are natural leaders, and that they soon command a band of young, rowdy shepherds, defending their flocks from wild animals and raiding the camps of rival herdsmen. As they grow into manhood, their true destiny begins to unfold. During a dispute with the shepherds of their grandfather Numitor, Remus is captured and taken to Alba Longa to face justice. At the same time, the shepherd Faustulus, believing the time is right, finally reveals to Romulus the secret of his birth. Romulus, his heart now filled with the sense of purpose and a desire for vengeance, gathers his band of shepherds and marches on the city. He frees his brother, and together they lead an uprising against the usurper. Amulius is killed, and their grandfather, the gentle Numitor, is restored to his rightful throne. Their heroic duty done, the twins are now faced with a new challenge. They are princes of Alba Longa, but they are not content to wait for their inheritance. They are men of the wilderness, and they yearn to build a city of their own, on the very hills where they were saved by the she-wolf. But this shared dream soon becomes a source of bitter conflict. Romulus wishes to build the new city on the Palatine Hill, the site of their miraculous rescue. Remus favours the Aventine Hill. Unable to agree, they decide to let the gods choose through augury, a sacred ritual of interpreting the flight of birds. They each stand on their chosen hill and wait for a sign. The omen comes first to Remus. 6 magnificent vultures circle above the Aventine, His followers erupt in a cheer, but moments later a second, more powerful omen appears to Romulus. 12 vultures descend upon the Palatine. A furious argument breaks out. Who had the true favour of the gods? Remus, who saw the birds first, or Romulus, who saw twice as many? The dispute cannot be resolved. The bond between the two brothers, a bond forged in a shared womb, in a basket on the river, and in the wildness of the hills, begins to fracture under the weight of their ambition. Ignoring the dispute, Romulus proceeds to plough the sacred boundary, the Pomerium, round his chosen hill, the Palatine. He begins to build a low wall of earth and stone, the first foundation of his new city. Remus, his heart filled with jealousy and resentment, approaches the fledgling wall, and in an act of deep mockery and contempt he leaps over it. "Is this the wall that will protect your people?" he taunts. In that moment, something inside Romulus snaps. In a fit of furious rage he strikes his brother down, killing him on the spot. As Remus lies dead at his feet, Romulus utters the dark and terrible founding words of his new city. "So shall it be for all who dare to cross my walls." The city is founded in fratricide, the shedding of a brother's blood. This dark act becomes a foundational part of the Roman character, a grim understanding that the security of the state, the integrity of its walls, is the highest law of all, a law for which even the most sacred bonds of family must be sacrificed. The new city, now named Rome after its founder, is born, but it is a city with a problem. It is a city of men. Romulus, now the first king of Rome, establishes his city as an asylum, a sanctuary for any and all who wish to join. Runaway slaves, exiles, debtors, and outcasts from all the neighbouring tribes flock to the new settlement. It is a city of the desperate, the ambitious, and the tough. But it is a city with no future, for there are no women. To solve this problem, Romulus devises a cunning and brutal plan. He invites the neighbouring tribes, including the Sabines, to a great festival in honour of the gods. As the Sabines and their families are enjoying the festivities, distracted by the games and the wine, Romulus gives a signal. His men draw their hidden swords and, in a coordinated act of mass abduction, they seize the young unmarried Sabine women and carry them off. This act, which history would remember as the rape of the Sabine women, immediately leads to war. The enraged Sabine men lay siege to Rome, but as the two armies are about to engage in a final bloody battle, a remarkable thing happens. The abducted Sabine women, now the wives of the Romans, run onto the battlefield. They stand between their fathers and brothers on one side and their new husbands on the other. Holding up their infant children, they plead for peace, crying that they do not wish to be made widows and orphans in a single day. Their courage and their plea shame the men into laying down their arms. A peace is made, and the two peoples, the Romans and the Sabines, agree to unite as one, and so the new city of Rome is secured. It is a city born from the gods and suckled by a wolf. It is a city founded on a brother's murder and populated through an act of mass abduction. It is a city of refugees and outcasts, a people forged in violence, pragmatism, and a deep, unshakable belief in their own divine destiny. This is the story the Romans told themselves, the myth that fueled their ambition for 1,000 years. It is a story that reminds them that they are descended from heroes, protected by the gods, and that the greatness of Rome is a prize worth any sacrifice. From this small muddy settlement on 7 hills, this city of myth and mud would soon cast off its kings and forge a new, even more powerful identity, the Republic. Segment 2, The Republic of Scars, Forging an Identity. The city founded in myth and mud, the city of Romulus, grew under the rule of 7 legendary kings. But the Roman spirit, forged in hardship and a fierce love of freedom, was not suited to the yoke of absolute monarchy. The final king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquin the Proud, was a tyrant. He ruled not with the consent of the people, but with fear and violence, seizing property, executing senators without trial, and treating the state as his own personal possession. The quiet resentment of the Roman people simmered, waiting for a spark to ignite it into a blaze of rebellion. That spark came not from a battle, but from a profound personal tragedy. The king's son, Sextus Tarquinius, was consumed by a wicked lust for Lucretia, the virtuous and respected wife of a Roman nobleman. One night, he went to her chambers and, threatening her with a sword, he raped her. The next day, Lucretia, her honour shattered, summoned her father and her husband. She told them what had been done to her, made them swear an oath of vengeance against the Tarquins, and then, declaring that no woman should live in shame, she drew a hidden dagger and took her own life. Her sacrifice was the final outrage. A kinsman named Lucius Junius Brutus, who had for years played the part of a fool to survive under the tyrant's rule, now cast off his disguise. He carried Lucretia's body into the public forum, and showing her wound to the assembled people, he delivered a fiery speech, calling for the expulsion of the tyrant and the end of monarchy forever. The people of Rome, their hearts stirred by this tragic spectacle, rose up in revolution. In the year 509 BCE, they drove Tarquin the Proud and his family into exile, vowing that they would never again be ruled by a king. The age of kings was over. The age of the Republic had begun. The very name they chose for their new state, Respublica, meant the public thing, or the people's affair. It was a radical declaration that the state belonged not to a single man, but to its citizens. This was not just a change in government, it was the birth of Rome's soul, a soul defined by a deep-seated hatred of tyranny and a fierce, almost religious devotion to liberty. The new republic was a complex and carefully balanced machine, designed with the single purpose of preventing the rise of another king. Supreme power was now vested not in one man, but in two consuls, who were elected by the people to serve for a single, one-year term. They held equal power, and each had the right to veto the other's decisions, an ingenious check against personal ambition. The true heart of the Republic, however, was the Senate, a council of the city's elder statesmen, the patricians, whose wisdom and experience were meant to guide the state. But this new republic was born into conflict, not just from without, but from within. Roman society was sharply divided between the patricians, the wealthy landowning aristocracy, and the plebeians, the common people, the farmers, the merchants, the artisans. In the early years, the patricians held all the power, interpreting the laws to their own benefit and treating the plebeians as little more than subjects. This injustice led to a long and bitter struggle known as the conflict of the orders. The plebeians, recognizing their own power as the soldiers and workers of the city, organized and at times seceded from the city, refusing to work or vent until their demands were met. Through this slow, grinding struggle, the plebeians won crucial rights. They were granted their own representatives, the tribunes of the plebs, who had the sacred power to veto any act of the Senate or the magistrates that harmed the common people. And they forced the creation of the law of the 12 Tables, a written legal code displayed publicly in the forum, ensuring that the law was known to all and could no longer be manipulated by the privileged few. The early republic was a place of constant argument, of social tension, and of hard-won compromise. It was a messy, imperfect system, but it forged a people who were deeply invested in the workings of their own state. This internal struggle took place against a backdrop of constant, unending warfare. The early Republic was a city fighting for its very survival. It was surrounded by hostile neighbours, the powerful Etruscans to the north, the rival Latin tribes, and the fierce Samnites in the mountains. For centuries, every spring, the gates of the Temple of Janus would be thrown open, a sign that Rome was at war. The Roman of this era was not a professional soldier. He was a citizen farmer, a civis. He was a man who would hear the call to arms, put down his plough, pick up his spear and his shield, and march off to defend the Republic. His loyalty was not to a general, but to the Senate and the people of Rome. This ideal of the citizen soldier, the man who serves the state not for pay but for duty, was perfectly embodied in the legend of Cincinnatus. The story goes that in a moment of dire crisis, with a Roman army trapped by an enemy, the Senate turned to him. They found him on his small farm ploughing his fields. They granted him the absolute power of a dictator to save the state. Cincinnatus left his plough, took command of the army, defeated the enemy, and celebrated a triumph. All within 16 days. And then he did something that would become a cornerstone of the Roman ideal. He immediately relinquished his absolute power and returned to his farm and his plough. He wanted no crown, no eternal glory. His duty was done, and he returned to the life of a simple citizen. This story, told and retold for generations, reinforced the core belief of the Republic. That power was a temporary trust, a service to the state, not a personal possession. It was this spirit of grim determination and civic duty that allowed Rome to slowly, brutally conquer the entire Italian peninsula. But as its power grew, it came face to face with an enemy unlike any it had ever known, a great maritime empire that controlled the trade routes of the Western Mediterranean, Carthage. The struggle between these two rising powers, a series of 3 conflicts known as the Punic Wars, would become the defining trial of the Roman Republic, a crucible that would either forge it into the master of the world or burn it to ashes. The First War was a long and grueling naval conflict over the island of Sicily. The Romans, a land-based power, had no real navy. In a testament to their relentless adaptability, they captured a Carthaginian warship that had run aground, copied its design and built an entire fleet from scratch. They were not natural sailors, but they turned sea battles into land battles by inventing a device called the corvus, a large gangplank with a spike that could be dropped onto an enemy ship, allowing their superior legionaries to storm across and fight hand to hand. After more than 20 years of fighting, Rome was victorious, but the struggle was far from over. In Carthage, a young boy had sworn a sacred oath upon an altar, an oath of eternal hatred for Rome. That boy grew up to become Hannibal Barca, one of the most brilliant and terrifying military commanders in all of history. In 218 BCE, he launched the Second Punic War, and he did so with an act of such audacious genius that it has echoed through the ages. He marched his army, which included dozens of war elephants, not by sea but by land, on an impossible journey from Spain across the Pyrenees, and then, in the dead of winter, over the treacherous snow-covered passes of the Alps. The journey was a nightmare. Men and animals froze to death, slipped from icy cliffs, and were ambushed by mountain tribes. But Hannibal pushed on, and he descended into Italy with a hardened veteran army, appearing where the Romans thought no enemy could ever come. For the next 15 years he would terrorize Italy, inflicting a series of catastrophic defeats on the Republic. The worst of these came at the Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE. Hannibal, with a smaller army, faced a massive Roman force of over 80,000 men. In a perfect execution of military strategy, he allowed his centre to buckle, drawing the Romans into a trap, and then had his cavalry swing around and attack them from the rear. The Roman army was completely encircled and annihilated. As many as 70,000 Roman soldiers were killed in a single day. It was the darkest hour in the history of the Republic. The city was in a state of panic. Any other power would have sued for peace, but it is here, in the face of utter disaster, that the true character of the Republic was revealed. The Romans did not surrender. They did not despair. They refused to negotiate with Hannibal as long as he stood on Italian soil. The Senate, with the spirit of grim resolve, levied new armies, enlisting young boys and even freeing slaves to fight. They adopted new tactics, the Fabian strategy of avoiding direct battle with Hannibal, instead harassing his supply lines and slowly wearing him down. This was the essence of Romanitas, of Romanness, an unyielding stubbornness, a refusal to break, a belief that Rome could endure any sacrifice to achieve ultimate victory. The tide finally turned with the emergence of a young Roman general as brilliant as Hannibal himself, Publius Cornelius Scipio. Scipio understood that Hannibal could not be defeated in Italy. Instead, he took the audacious step of taking the war to Carthage's home turf in North Africa. This forced the Carthaginians to recall Hannibal from Italy to defend their city. The final epic showdown came in 202 BCE on the plains of Zama. There, the two greatest generals of the age met in battle. Scipio, having studied Hannibal's tactics, used them against him, and for the first time Hannibal was decisively defeated. The Second Punic War was over. Rome was the master of the Mediterranean. The Republic had been tested by the greatest military genius of the age, brought to the very brink of annihilation, and had not only survived but had triumphed. The city of Rome was no longer just an Italian power, it was a world power. The Republic was now an empire in all but name. It was a republic of scars, each one a testament to a battle endured, a disaster overcome. But these very scars, this very success, had planted the seeds of a new crisis. The immense wealth, the vast new territories were here, and the rise of powerful generals would soon begin to tear at the very fabric of the Republic, leading it down a dark and bloody path to its own destruction. Segment 3. The Eagle and the Abyss, the Fall of the Republic. The Roman Republic, having survived the fury of Hannibal and the epic trial of the Punic Wars, now stood as the undisputed master of the Mediterranean. Its legions were invincible, its influence absolute. A torrent of wealth, slaves and tribute poured into the city from its newly conquered provinces. From the outside, Rome was a shining testament to strength and order. But inside, this very success was acting as a slow and insidious poison, corrupting the very foundations upon which the Republic had been built. The citizen farmer, the ideal of Cincinnatus who fought for duty and then returned to his plough, was a dying breed. The vast wealth of empire was being consolidated in the hands of a few powerful aristocratic families who bought up the small farms and created massive estates, called latifundia, worked by armies of slaves. The very soldiers who had won the empire now returned home to find themselves landless, jobless, and destitute, forced to flock to the city of Rome, a teeming, chaotic metropolis filled with a growing and resentful urban poor. The Republic had conquered the world, but in doing so it had begun to lose its soul. This is the story of its fall, a long and bloody descent into the abyss, a tale of a system that was torn apart by the ambition of its greatest men. The first tremor to shake the foundations of this corrupt new order came not from a foreign enemy, but from within the heart of the Roman aristocracy itself. Two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, grandsons of the great Scipio Africanus, watched the growing inequality with alarm. They saw the plight of the landless veterans and believed it was a betrayal of the Republic's core values. In 103 BCE, Tiberius Gracchus, elected as a tribune of the plebs, proposed a radical idea, a land reform law that would break up the massive public estates held by the wealthy and redistribute the land to the poor. To the Senate, this was not a reform. It was a revolution, a direct attack on their wealth and their power. They fought him at every turn. But Tiberius, a passionate and sometimes reckless idealist, took his case directly to the People's Assembly, bypassing the Senate in a move that, while legal, shattered political tradition. He succeeded in passing his law, but he'd made powerful and unforgiving enemies. When he stood for re-election as tribune, a mob of senators and their clients, armed with clubs and broken furniture, stormed his rally. In the chaos, Tiberius Gracchus and 300 of his followers were clubbed to death. Their bodies were unceremoniously thrown into the Tiber River. For the first time in centuries, political disagreement in the Sacred Heart of Rome had been settled not with debate but with murder. The abyss had opened. A decade later, his younger brother Gaius would follow in his footsteps, pushing for even more radical reforms. He too would meet a violent end, taking his own life as his enemies closed in. The Gracchi brothers were noble failures, martyrs for a cause that was, for now, lost. But their blood, spilled on the stones of the Forum, had stained the Republic forever. It had revealed a brutal new truth. The old rules of compromise and debate were dead. From now on, power in Rome would be decided by force. From the ashes of the Gracchi's dream, a new and more dangerous kind of leader emerged. Gaius Marius was a new man, a brilliant general from outside the traditional noble families. He saw that the old system of a citizen militia was no longer viable for policing a vast empire. To fight off Germanic invasions in the north, he pushed through a series of revolutionary military reforms. He abolished the property requirement for military service, allowing the landless poor, the very men the Gracchi had tried to help, to enlist in the army. This single act would prove to be the death knell of the Republic. The Roman army was no longer a temporary assembly of citizen farmers loyal to the state. It was now a professional standing army of long-serving soldiers who were loyal to one man and one man only, the general who paid them, who fed them, and who promised them a plot of land upon retirement. The Roman legions had become private armies, their eagles following not the will of the Senate but the ambition of their commanders. The terrifying potential of this new army was soon unleashed upon Rome itself. Marius's bitter rival, the aristocratic general Lucius Cornelius Sulla, feeling his honour had been slighted, did the unthinkable. In 88 BC he marched his own legions on the city of Rome, an act of treason so profound that it had been unimaginable just a generation earlier. He seized the city by force, and the first of many brutal civil wars began. After years of fighting, Sulla returned to Rome as its undisputed master. He declared himself dictator and unleashed a reign of terror known as the Proscriptions. Each day he would post a list in the forum of his political enemies. Anyone on that list could be legally hunted down and murdered for a cash reward, their property confiscated by the state. A wave of paranoia and bloodshed swept through the city. Old scores were settled, fortunes were made on the backs of the dead, and the sons of the proscribed were barred from public life forever. Sulla had shattered the very concept of Roman citizenship. He eventually, surprisingly, relinquished his dictatorship and retired. But he left behind a republic that was traumatized, its laws broken, its spirit shattered. He had created a terrifying new playbook for ambitious men. If you had a loyal army, the city of Rome itself was just another prize to be taken. It was from this chaos that the next generation of giants would rise. the men who would deliver the final fatal blows to the dying republic. 3 men, each a titan of ambition, formed an unofficial secret alliance to control the state, an alliance history would call the First Triumvirate. There was Pompey the Great, the celebrated military hero who had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates. There was Marcus Licinius Crassus, a man of insatiable greed who was by far the wealthiest man in Rome. And there was a young, charismatic, and deeply indebted politician from one of Rome's oldest patrician families, Gaius Julius Caesar. Together they used their combined wealth, fame, and political cunning to bend the Republic to their will, bypassing the Senate and carving up the state for their own benefit. But it was Caesar who possessed the true world-altering genius. He secured for himself the governorship of Gaul, the wild and unconquered lands beyond the Alps. For the next 8 years, Caesar would wage a brilliant and brutal campaign of conquest. He was a master of strategy, a charismatic leader who shared every hardship with his men, and a ruthless commander who was responsible for the death or enslavement of over 1 million Gauls. He chronicled his own victories in his famous commentaries, a masterpiece of political propaganda that made him a legendary hero to the people back in Rome. By the end of his campaign, he possessed 3 things that made him the most dangerous man in the world: a fanatically loyal veteran army, immense personal wealth, and an almost godlike reputation. Back in Rome, his allies had grown fearful. Crassus was dead, killed in a disastrous campaign in the east. Pompey, now aligned with the nervous and hostile Senate, saw Caesar not as a partner, but as a rival who had grown too powerful. The Senate, fearing his return, issued a decree. Caesar must disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen to face prosecution for his actions in Gaul. This was the moment of truth. Caesar now stood with a single legion on the banks of a small, shallow river in northern Italy, the Rubicon. This river marked the sacred legal boundary of Italy. To cross it with an army was an act of treason, a declaration of war against his own country. Imagine him there, in the cold winter of 49 BCE, the water flowing quietly, the standards of his legion glinting in the pale light. He paused, his mind weighing the consequences. To turn back meant political ruin and likely death at the hands of his enemies. To cross meant plunging the entire Roman world into another devastating civil war. For a long moment, the fate of the Republic hung in the balance, resting on the decision of this one man. Then, with a quiet resolve, he made his choice. He turned to his men and uttered the immortal words, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast. He spurred his horse into the cold water, and his legion followed. That single act, the crossing of a small, insignificant river, was the final fatal wound from which the Republic would never recover. The system of laws and traditions that had held for 500 years was now broken beyond repair. Caesar was marching on Rome, and the abyss that had opened with the death of the Gracchi was about to swallow the Republic whole. The age of the citizen was ending. The age of the emperor was about to begin. The murder of Julius Caesar on the Ides of March did not, as its conspirators had hoped, restore the Republic. The assassins, who called themselves the Liberators, believed that by killing the tyrant they could turn back the clock to a simpler, purer time. But the Republic they loved was already a ghost, a hollowed-out system that had long since died in the fires of its own internal conflicts. Caesar's death did not heal its wounds. It only tore them open once more, unleashing a final convulsive wave of civil war that would drown the last vestiges of the old order in blood. The city of Rome once again was a scene of chaos and fear. The Senate was powerless, the people were a grieving, angry mob, and in the power vacuum left by Caesar, new and even more ruthless figures began to circle. At the centre of this storm were two men. The first was Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal and charismatic general, a man of great military talent and even greater appetites. He saw himself as Caesar's natural successor. But Caesar's will revealed a shocking surprise. He had not named Antony as his heir. Instead, he had posthumously adopted and left the bulk of his immense fortune to a young man few had ever heard of. His 19-year-old grandnephew, a sickly and bookish teenager named Gaius Octavius, whom we now call Octavian. When Octavian arrived in Rome, no one took him seriously. He was a boy, an unknown, a seemingly insignificant player in a game of giants. Antony famously dismissed him, but they had all underestimated him. Octavian possessed none of Caesar's military genius or personal charisma, but he had inherited something far more valuable: Caesar's name, Caesar's money, and a mind of astonishing political cunning. He was patient, methodical, and utterly ruthless. While Antony postured and gave grand speeches, Octavian quietly used his inheritance to pay Caesar's veterans, securing their loyalty. He soon formed a pragmatic, if tense, alliance with Mark Antony and another of Caesar's former generals, Lepidus. This was the second triumvirate, a formal, state-sanctioned, three-man dictatorship. Their first act was to unleash a new and even more terrifying wave of proscriptions than Sulla's. They methodically hunted down and executed thousands of their political enemies, not just to eliminate threats, but to seize their property to pay for their armies. It was during this brutal purge that the Republic's greatest orator and defender, Cicero, was killed, his head and hands cut off and nailed to the rostra in the Forum as a grim warning to all who dared to speak against the new order. With their enemies in Rome eliminated, the triumvirs turned their attention to Caesar's assassins, who had fled to the east. At the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE, the last hopes of the old Republic were crushed, and its champions Brutus and Cassius took their own lives. The world was now in the hands of three men, but three was still too many. Lepidus was soon sidelined, leaving the two great titans to face each other: Antony, who took control of the rich and decadent East, and Octavian, who held the traditional heart of the empire, Italy and the West. A final inevitable conflict was brewing. Antony established his base in Alexandria, where he fell into a legendary love affair with the last Ptolemaic queen of Egypt, the brilliant and captivating Cleopatra. Together, they ruled the East like Hellenistic monarchs, dreaming of a new kind of empire. Back in Rome, Octavian, a master of propaganda, seized upon this. He painted Antony not as a Roman general, but as a decadent traitor, a man who had abandoned his Roman wife, Octavian's own sister, for a foreign enchantress. He portrayed Antony as a man who had gone native, who wished to move the capital of the empire to Egypt and rule as an Eastern king. This was a brilliant and deeply effective smear campaign. It positioned Octavian not as a power-hungry warlord, but as the defender of traditional Roman values against a foreign threat. The final showdown came in 31 BCE, at the great naval battle of Actium off the coast of Greece. It was not a particularly heroic or bloody battle. It was a masterpiece of strategy by Octavian's brilliant general Agrippa, who trapped Antony and Cleopatra's larger, heavier fleet in a bay. In a moment of panic or desperation, Antony and Cleopatra broke through the line and fled back to Egypt, their abandoned fleet quickly surrendering. The war was effectively over. A year later, as Octavian's legions closed in on Alexandria, both Antony and Cleopatra took their own lives, ending the last dynasty of the pharaohs and leaving Octavian as the sole, undisputed master of the entire Roman world. after a century of non-stop civil war, from Marius and Sulla to Caesar and Pompey, and finally to Octavian and Antony, the bloodshed was finally over. A great collective sigh of relief passed through the Mediterranean. The Roman world was exhausted. It was tired of prescriptions, of civil wars, of the endless ambition of its great men. It craved peace and stability above all else. And Octavian, the quiet, calculating young man who had waded through a river of blood to get to the top, was now in the perfect position to give it to them. He returned to Rome in triumph, but he knew he stood on a knife's edge. He had absolute power, but the fate of his great-uncle Caesar was a constant, chilling reminder of what happened to men who seemed too much like kings. The word rex, king, was still the most hated word in the Roman political vocabulary. So, Octavian performed a final breathtaking act of political theatre. In 27 BCE, in a carefully staged event, he appeared before the Senate and announced that he was relinquishing all of his emergency powers and restoring the Republic to the Senate and the people of Rome. The senators, many of whom owed their careers and their lives to him, were both relieved and terrified. They knew the Republic was a hollow shell, incapable of governing the empire, and that without a strong leader, the civil wars would simply start again. In a show of grateful panic, they begged him to reconsider. They showered him with honours and titles, and bestowed upon him a new name, one that was religious and revered but not political: Augustus. This was the Augustan settlement, a political masterpiece of illusion and pragmatism. Augustus had created a new system, one where he held all the real power, but all the old institutions of the Republic remained in place. The Senate still met, the consuls were still elected, and the people's assemblies still voted. But Augustus controlled the most important levers of power. He was the commander-in-chief of the majority of the legions. He controlled the treasury, and he personally oversaw the vital grain supply to the city of Rome. He took for himself no title of king or dictator. He called himself only princeps, the first citizen, a humble title that suggested he was merely the most distinguished among equals. It was a brilliant lie, but it was a lie the Roman world desperately wanted to believe. It allowed them to have the stability of a monarchy without having to abandon the cherished memory of their republic. And with this new, stable order, Augustus ushered in an era of unprecedented peace and prosperity that would last for the next 2 centuries, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For the first time in 100 years, the gates of the Temple of Janus were closed. The wars were over, the borders of the empire were secured. Augustus launched a massive program of reconstruction. He built new temples, new aqueducts, new public buildings. He established a fire brigade and a police force for the city of Rome. He famously boasted that he had found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. He also launched a program of social and moral reform, encouraging marriage and childbirth, and attempting to restore the traditional Roman virtues of piety, duty, and family that had been eroded during the decadent chaos of the late Republic. Augustus ruled for over 40 years, a long and remarkably stable reign that transformed the Roman world. The sickly, underestimated boy who had arrived in Rome to claim a dangerous inheritance had become its saviour. He had been a ruthless and bloody revolutionary in his youth, but in his maturity he became a wise and patient statesman. He had ended a century of civil war, not by destroying the Republic, but by embalming it. He had created a system that would give the Mediterranean world 200 years of relative peace, a golden age where trade flourished, cities grew, and the idea of a single, unified, civilized world under Roman rule became a reality. He was not a king, He was something new, something more. He was the first citizen, the revered one, the architect of the Roman Empire. The peace that Augustus had purchased with blood and brilliance settled over the Roman world. For the first time in a century, the legions were not marching against fellow Romans, but were stationed on distant, quiet frontiers. This long peace, the Pax Romana, allowed the immense energy of the Roman people to be turned from conquest to construction. The story of the empire at its height is a tale written not just in laws and legions, but in stone, mortar, and water. It is the story of how Rome, having mastered the art of war, now mastered the art of building, engineering, a civilization of unprecedented scale and sophistication. This new chapter was, above all, a story of connection. The vast, sprawling empire stretching from the misty shores of Britain to the hot sands of Mesopotamia was stitched together by a revolutionary network of roads. The famous saying, "all roads lead to Rome," was not a metaphor. It was a literal physical reality. These were not simple dirt tracks. Roman roads were marvels of engineering built in layers of stone, gravel and sand, crowned with perfectly fitted paving stones and designed to last for centuries. They cut straight through forests, over mountains, and across marshes, a testament to the Roman belief that nature itself should bend to the will of the empire. Along these arteries flowed the lifeblood of the Roman world. Legions marching to the frontiers, officials carrying decrees from the emperor, merchants with their carts laden with silk from the east or grain from Egypt, and ordinary people journeying on a scale never before possible. The roads made the empire a single connected space, shrinking a vast and diverse world and binding it all to the great heart of the city itself. If the roads were the empire's arteries, then the aqueducts were its veins, carrying a different but equally vital life force, water. In a feat of breathtaking engineering, Roman architects built hundreds of miles of these graceful stone channels. Using nothing more than the gentle, precise power of gravity, they brought millions of gallons of fresh, clean water from distant mountain springs into the heart of teeming cities. This constant flow of water was the ultimate symbol of Roman civilization. It fed the grand public baths, supplied the ornamental fountains that graced the city squares, and provided a source of public drinking water that dramatically improved urban health. To see an aqueduct striding across a valley on its series of elegant arches was to witness the power and confidence of Rome made manifest, an empire so advanced it could make water run uphill, or at least make it seem to. This mastery of engineering was powered by a revolutionary invention, Roman concrete. This was not the simple mortar of earlier times. By mixing volcanic ash with lime and rubble, the Romans created a building material that was not only incredibly strong, but could also set underwater, allowing them to build bridges, harbours, and foundations of a scale and durability previously unimaginable. It was with this miraculous material that they built the icons of their power. They built the Pantheon, with its vast, unsupported concrete dome, still the largest in the world, a perfect hemisphere with a single oculus opening to the heavens, a temple that felt as much like a feat of science as an act of worship. And they built the Colosseum, the greatest amphitheatre in the world, a tiered mountain of stone and concrete that could hold over 50,000 spectators, all gathered to witness the brutal and spectacular entertainments that defined Roman public life. These great engineering projects were the hardware of the empire, the physical skeleton that gave it structure and strength. But what of the people who lived within this skeleton? What was life like for the average Roman, walking in the shadow of these magnificent structures? To understand this, we must zoom in from the grand scale of the empire to the chaotic, vibrant, and often squalid reality of a single street in the city of Rome. Here we find that there were two Romes, living side by side yet worlds apart. There was the Rome of the wealthy patrician. His life was one of comfort and luxury, lived out in a spacious private home called a domus. Its rooms were arranged around a quiet, open-air courtyard, its walls decorated with vibrant frescoes, and its floors covered in intricate mosaics. He spent his days engaged in politics or business, and his evenings reclining on a couch at a lavish dinner party, served by his household slaves. Then there was the Rome of the common plebeian. Your life, as one of the teeming masses, was lived in a completely different world. You were crammed with your family into a single dark, stuffy room in a massive multi-story apartment building called an insula. These were rickety, poorly constructed tenements built from timber and cheap brick, and they were notorious fire traps. There was no running water above the ground floor. Sanitation was a constant foul reality. You would use a simple chamber pot, which was often unceremoniously emptied out of a window into the street below, despite laws forbidding it. The streets of Rome, for all its marble temples, were noisy, crowded and filthy, a constant assault on the senses. Yet, there were places where these two worlds would meet. The first was the public bathhouse. The baths were the true heart of Roman social life, a uniquely Roman institution. For a very small fee, any citizen, rich or poor, could enter. Inside you would find a sprawling complex of rooms, a hot room to sweat, a warm room for relaxing, and a cold plunge pool for refreshing. But the baths were for more than just getting clean. They were where business deals were made, where politicians gossiped, and where friends would meet to exercise, read, or simply pass the time. It was the great social equalizer, a place where, for a few hours, the rigid hierarchies of Roman society would soften. The other great meeting place was the arena, the home of the circuses that, along with the free grain dole, or bread, formed the famous policy of bread and circuses. This was the emperor's unspoken contract with his people. He would keep them fed and entertained, and in return they would not rebel. The entertainment was a spectacle of unparalleled brutality and excitement. Tens of thousands of Romans, from the emperor in his imperial box to you in the cheap seats at the very top, would gather to watch the gladiatorial games. They would cheer as men fought to the death, as exotic animals were hunted and slaughtered, and as criminals were executed in elaborate theatrical ways. For a day, the struggles of your own difficult life were forgotten, replaced by the thrilling, vicarious spectacle of life and death playing out on the sand below. This was the paradox of Rome. It was an empire capable of building roads that would last 1,000 years, yet its capital was a city of flammable, overcrowded slums. It was a civilization that brought clean water to 1 million people, yet their streets often ran with filth. It was a society that produced profound works of law and philosophy, yet its greatest entertainment was the public slaughter of human beings. This intricate system of magnificent engineering and brutal social control was the software that kept the empire running, a complex and contradictory world of both marble and mud, of both order and chaos. Of course, here is a script combining the final 4 segments of your video, written in the requested style and kept under 800 words. Segments 5 to 8. The Empire of Stone, The Life of the Street, and The Long Twilight's Echo. The peace that Augustus forged allowed Rome to turn its genius from conquering to constructing. The empire at its height was a story written in stone and mortar, a civilization held together by breathtaking feats of engineering. From the misty forests of Britain to the deserts of Syria, A network of stone-paved roads acted as the arteries of the empire, carrying legions, trade, and messages with relentless efficiency. Graceful aqueducts strode across valleys on elegant arches, delivering millions of gallons of clean water to teeming cities, a luxury and a symbol of a world brought into order. This was all made possible by Roman concrete, a revolutionary material used to create architectural marvels like the Pantheon with its celestial dome and the mighty Colosseum, an arena built not just for entertainment, but as a declaration of imperial power. These were the bones of the empire, a skeleton of stone and logic that would outlast the emperors themselves. Within this grand framework lived the Roman people, their daily lives a study in contrast. For the poor plebeian masses, home was a cramped, dark room in a rickety apartment building, an insula, where the constant threat of fire was as real as the stench from the streets below. Even in this squalor, the genius of Roman social engineering provided outlets. The grand public baths were the heart of city life, where, for a small coin, a citizen of any class could bathe, exercise, gossip, and conduct business. And to keep the massive, restless population content, the emperors followed a simple formula: bread and circuses. Free grain kept their bellies full, and the brutal, spectacular gladiatorial games in the Colosseum kept their minds occupied. For a day, the hardships of life were forgotten in the roar of the crowd and the sight of blood on the sand. A brilliant and barbaric system of social control. But no empire, however well engineered, is eternal. The long peace of the Pax Romana eventually gave way to a century of chaos, known as the Crisis of the 3rd Century. Plague, constant civil war and economic collapse shook the empire to its core. Powerful emperors like Diocletian tried to manage the decay by dividing the vast territory into a rule of 4, a desperate attempt to govern a world that had become too large to control. Was followed by Constantine the Great, who made 2 decisions that would change the course of history. He legalized the growing Christian faith, shifting the spiritual soul of the empire, and he moved the capital from the old city of Rome to a new eastern city he named Constantinople. The heart of the empire was no longer in Italy. Its long, slow twilight had begun. The final end of the Western Empire was not a dramatic explosion, but a quiet, weary collapse. Overwhelmed by migrating tribes and internal decay, the city of Rome was sacked in 410, a psychological blow from which it never recovered. Finally, in 46 AD, the last Western Roman emperor, a boy ironically named Romulus Augustus, was quietly deposed. No one was named to replace him. The empire in the West had simply faded away, and yet Rome never truly died. Its physical body was gone, but its ghost, its powerful echo, would shape the future of the world. The law of Rome became the foundation for Western legal systems. The Latin language evolved into the beautiful Romance languages of French, Spanish, and Italian. Its architectural principles were copied for centuries. The Christian Church, adopted and spread by the empire, would go on to be the dominant force in medieval Europe, with Rome as its sacred centre. The story of Rome is not one of failure but of transformation. It is the story of an empire so powerful that even in its death, it laid the foundations for the next 1,000 years of civilization. It is an echo in the stone, a quiet whisper of order, law and legacy that we can still hear today.